The topic for tonight is women rabbis. Now, I think we've talked about this in the past. I want to go with this in a little bit of a different direction because it's becoming a big issue in the States, and it touches upon many additional issues beyond women rabbis and auxiliary issues that in the States touches upon the very definition of orthodoxy in the States, what's happening with the Orthodox community in the States. A little bit in their terms of Eretz Yisrael and some other things as well. The difficulty the difficulty is that the definitions that are involved are all over the place. What are we actually dealing with in terms of the definitions? And they're unclear. In addition, there's another lack of clarity in the sense that we're not we don't have the full understanding of what we mean by these definitions in the Orthodox world and outside the Orthodox world. Let me sort of give you an example as a starting point of what I mean by that definition. See, we're working in two worlds at the same time. We're working within the world of Orthodox Judaism, and we're working in the world of Western society. And the overlap between those two worlds is sometimes something which we don't really even recognize. We often don't even recognize that our values in this overlap is often not recognizable. I remember many years ago I was once giving a shiur, and I just mentioned in passing something about whether the Torah has a value of freedom of religion. Okay? And there was a guy there who was Orthodox, went to Orthodox schools, grew up in an Orthodox family, who was totally shocked by this. What do you mean we don't believe in freedom of religion? He was absolutely shocked by it. Now the truth is, though, as people say, no, we don't believe in freedom of religion. Of course we don't believe in freedom of religion. Look at the Chumash. Right? We destroy all these idols and so forth and so forth. The problem is, though, is if you ask the average American about freedom of religion, they'll tell you they believe it's a value. They'll tell you they think it's right. Okay? I'm just talking on a gut level. When the Taliban blew up those major idols in Afghanistan years ago, right? People made a whole thing about this and so forth and so forth. What would you do if an Orthodox Jewish government took over that country? Would you not also blow up those idols? Now, the truth is you wouldn't really have to, because those idols aren't really being used anymore. We have different laws concerning freedom of religion. But the fact is that we have this concept, like we talk about Eretz Yisrael, and it's great because of all the freedoms and freedom of religion. And if Eretz Yisrael was an Orthodox Jewish country, would we have freedom of religion? Now, if you say no, well, what do you think about freedom of religion? What do you personally think about it? Do you think it's a value or not? Now the truth is that most American Jews feel good about Israel having freedom of religion. I'm talking about most Orthodox American Jews feel good about Israel practicing freedom of religion. Why? Because they benefited from freedom of religion. It's been indoctrinated into their own idea about the value of freedom of religion. The point is, though, how do you explain that halachically? How do you understand freedom of religion from a halachic perspective, especially when you read the fact that when Yeshua went into Canaan, he blew up all those. He basically wiped out all the idols. Didn't seem to have too much freedom of religion there. But then again, it's a different perspective. You start getting into some answers to understand some answers. Now, the truth is, though, it's just one example of overlap of values. The issue in America, in many ways, is not, America has these things and so on. It's the fact that in America you have very strong value systems that are integrated into your mind, into your perspective. Right? Concepts, I'm not just on America, Canada. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech. All these rights. And the fact is that as Orthodox Jews, do you abide by those values? So there are Orthodox Jews who might be very funny and very, very straightforward and say, now we really don't believe in it, but if you're going to extend those rights to us, it's in our benefit to have them. But if I was in charge, I wouldn't want those rights. Okay? Okay? There are people trying to get that argument. No, if I was in an Orthodox world, we would not have freedom of religion. But in America, if they want to give us free religion, it's tremendous. We'll take two. Right? Tremendous. I once saw a person actually make that statement in the air. Someone once asked this person, wasn't a Jewish thing, person once asked the person and said, you don't believe in freedom of speech. Your whole philosophy is against freedom of speech. Yet you are now arguing for freedom of speech. You should be allowed to do something. This was in the United States, where someone was arguing for freedom of speech. They should be allowed to do something, and the press basically challenged this person and said, "You don't believe in freedom of speech." Okay, how can we corner? He says, "If you're stupid enough to give me freedom of speech, then I'm going to use it. But I wouldn't be so stupid as to give it to you." Okay, you all know the case I'm talking about? Where this person looked really, and they heard Jews give the same argument, right? The person who said that was the head of the American Nazi Party before he marched in Skokie, and was suing the court for the right to march in Skokie under freedom of speech. And the press was there and said, "You don't even believe in freedom of speech." And he said, "Listen, if you're stupid enough to give us freedom of speech, why shouldn't I take advantage? But if I was in charge, I'd never give over freedom of speech." But the fact is, we don't feel that. We believe in some value there. And the fact is most Jews don't recognize the even possibility of conflicts between Torah and American values, especially American values that they really plug into, that they're indoctrinated with from youth. Now, that aspect really comes up with issues like women rabbis. Because the fact is that in many ways, we talk a little bit about women's liberation in terms of, on the fringe, they go overboard, this and that and so forth and so forth. But in terms of equal pay for equal work, Jews think that that's great. Right? The same way as you have in terms of, I can't think of a halachic argument with this other one, but the fact of the matter is, we're all on the forefront of arguing for racial equality and for civil rights. Right? Equal pay, for equal work, so forth and so forth. Okay? The point is, though, is that you basically, what's the underlying concept there? So, the fact is that the underlying concept is egalitarianism. That men and women are ultimately equal. And the truth is, as human beings, they are equal. Right? Men and women are equal. They just have a few differences and, few biological differences. But aren't they basically equal? And this whole argument existed. The whole argument existed. And in the early years of women's liberation, you argued men and women had a difference in the way they thought, you would get attacked. Then you had the work where, well, no, not exactly. You had men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and there's a little bit of difference between them, and so forth and so forth. And then you get into issues, but then again, they're all equal. They're all equal human beings. Point is, though, is what is the halachic perspective on the difference between men and women? Fact is, though, is that the distinction between men and women is much more embedded in the system than in the American system. The fact is, that halacha seems to point to a much more fundamental distinction between men and women, as indicated in laws that distinguish between men and women that have nothing to do with their biological distinctions. Right? Okay? And usually when you talk about the distinction between men and women, people like to throw out some biological distinctions, but if you really put it under a microscope, you find out that those arguments with regard to biological distinctions really are problematic. Okay? Now, one of those distinctions is a woman can't be a dayan. A woman can't be a judge in the Jewish court. Now, why can't women be judges in the Jewish court? Now, the truth is there are many women today who are judges, right? 3 of the Supreme Court justices of the United States are women right now. Okay? So, does it mean women can't really be judges? Are those women really incompetent? It really shows up, and so I mean, we're just helping them out? Of course not. So why can't women be judges in halacha? Now, of course, there is a shita in Tosfos, the Das Yachid in Tosfos said that women can be judges. There is a very minority opinion that says women can be judges. The fact is, you deal with it, and everyone throws out the classic question: if women can't be judges, what about Dvorah? Right? So the fact of the matter is most people say that Dvorah basically taught the law. The court would sit there in judgment, and then Dvorah would hear the case, and then the judges would actually go over to Dvorah and say, "Tell us, what do you think?" And she'd say, "This is what I think." Okay, now we'll go judge. But she could not be a judge. That's where Tosfos says, you see, from Dvorah, they can't be judges. There's a whole issue with that. But the fact of the matter is, white women can't be judges. So the problem is that it seems that we have a problem trying to explain that. So it seems to be just the very fact that halacha makes a distinction between men and women that is much more fundamental and extensive than biological distinction. So therefore, how do we understand that? The question exists: are men and women too qualitatively different, or are they both basically human beings with some quantitative, with some other distinction? And there's some people who really argue that men and women have to be seen as almost two separate species. Other people say they're human beings just divided by sex. But the fact is that definition, that distinction, is very, very contrary to the egalitarian mode of the United States, Canada. Now the point is that but on the other hand, we accept that value. So the point is, how do you accept that value and mesh that value with halacha, or is that value supposed to be totally rejected because you're a halachic Jew? Now the fact is, you see some tension like this, and you see sources both ways in a halacha way. And also, for example, almost every time someone tries to explain a reason for why women are distinct from men, is because women have an obligation to take care of kids. I think that's always the classic answer. Okay, what's the problem with that answer? There's absolutely no halachic obligation on women to take care of kids. Zero. None. Okay? The same Mishnah which everyone knows about the difference between men and women in mitzvahs aseh man grama, in time-oriented positive commandments, men are obligated in time-oriented commandments, women are not. That same Mishnah also makes a distinction in other categories of mitzvot. all the mitzvahs of a parent on a child are only obligations on men and not obligations on women. Okay? Which is interesting. Why is that? Especially if you think women are supposed to be the parents. They're supposed to be the real parenting individuals. So the fact is you got issues just understanding the Torah perspective. So, but what I was saying is that even within Torah you have issues, and then you throw it out into the world of another value system which we have incorporated. And the reason we've incorporated American values is because we have benefited from them. So we see them in a positive light. Boy, America, by arguing freedom of religion, has allowed us to foster, to grow. Moshe used to refer to America as a Medina Shel Chesed. So therefore, gee, that seems to imply that maybe this country that treats us in a positive fashion with freedom of religion and rights and so forth, that's a good thing. So that how we understand us, if we don't extend those same rights to other people. And those are fundamental questions that most people don't really deal with. They really don't deal with them in a fundamental way. By the way, I'm just throwing this out on that issue I just said before about the definition of a woman. There's an important Akedah Yitzchak vis-a-vis Rachel. Okay, Akedah Yitzchak was a medieval commentary, major medieval commentary, and he points out that when Rachel comes to Yaakov and says, I need a kid, right, or I'll die, right, Yaakov gets very angry. And Yaakov basically says, it's out of my hands. I'm doing what I can, but it's out of my hands, right? The fact of that is, the case Jesus says, why was Yaakov so angry? Okay, because he says that one aspect of a woman is the fact that she's a mother, but there's a more significant aspect of a woman, the very fact she's a human being. Okay, and Rachel had a purpose outside of being a mother. So Yaakov says, listen, your value is Rachel, right? Be Rachel, and hopefully Kosh Baruch Hu will be mazachi you with having a kid, but you still have value just being Rachel. Okay, so the fact that, and really you have value because you're a human being. But what I'm really getting at is that you find these ideas within Torah and so forth and so forth. But the fact is you're really dealing with a very complicated model when you start dealing with the Jew in North America. The Jew in Catholic Spain. There's Catholicism. We're not Catholics. In North America, that philosophy was something that got ingrained in us and integrated with us, and we saw value in it. We benefited from it. And the question is, okay, so what do we say? So when you look at issues of women rabbis, what happens is you start dealing with, well, wait a sec. Why can't women be a rabbi? Because there's an attitude that we think egalitarianism has a value. But then what do you do with all the halachas that seem to imply that there is no egalitarianism? And the fact is that separation. I mean, it's interesting because I once was talking to Rabbi Lamb, who there's a book called Sanctity of the Synagogue, which was it was a work that was developed in response to a court case in Michigan in the 1950s. There was a Orthodox synagogue where the board voted to take down the mechitza. Now, the fact is one member of the shul went to court and said this could not happen because in the Constitution, the shul was Orthodox. And they could not get rid of the mechitza because that's fundamental to Orthodoxy. The guy won in the secular court in Michigan. And it was a big court case. And there were some major filings on his behalf from major personalities who wrote articles arguing that one of the fundamental principles of Orthodox prayer is the separation between the sexes with the mechitza. Therefore, you find articles within this, and he collected all this material. I think his name was Lapin. He collected all this material, including the eventual court decision, so forth, in a book called Sanctity of the Synagogue, which is perhaps the major work now on Mechitza. In it are articles from the Rav, from Rabbi Soloveitchik. There's an article from Norman Lamb. There's an article from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There was an article, I think, from the Sridi H wrote something. The Sridi H was major scholar from Europe. There were some major articles, okay, all arguing for why the Mechitzas. Ramosha wrote something on it. That's where you find the famous machlokas between Ramosha and the Rav about how high Mechitza has to be. Okay, the fact of the matter is, or you also find the Satmar Rav also wrote something. So you find the major machlokas between the Satmar Rav and Ramosha, where the Satmar Rav says the purpose of Mechitza is so you don't see the women, and Ramosha says the purpose of Mechitza is so you don't talk to the women. Okay, so therefore Ramosha says it's okay to see them. Satmar Rav said no. But there you had all these major players in the Orthodox world sending in articles and so forth. But the fact is Norman Lamb wrote an article, and in his article he makes a point. I remember in passing, he says, you're all into mixed seating, but we still don't have women cantors. You would never argue, if you're arguing egalitarianism, we don't argue women cantors, we don't argue women rabbis. This is in the 50s. Says, so there's obviously a limit to egalitarianism. So I remember speaking to Rabbi Lamb, and I said, remember your article where you said there's a limit on it? And he looked at me, and said, it worked in the 50s, not anymore. But the fact is that that's egalitarianism. Wherever you draw the line, egalitarianism says there should not be, men and women are equal. The point is, though, is halacha basically says men and women don't, they're equal, separate but equal. All these other things, which really brings in mind, the whole argument with the blacks in the South of separate but equal, and all the problems with separate but equal existed. But the fact is clearly that's a halachic position. The point is, though, it does put you at odds with the major trend. I mean, I've heard people argue about women being separate but equal, and equal but different, so forth. And immediately I think about Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court decision, which Brown versus Board of Education overturned, basically upheld that blacks and whites were equal, but they could be treated differently. Equal but separate. And that's where they said, as long as blacks and whites both have schools, the schools don't have to be integrated. Brown versus Education said, no, if you really believe in equality, then you need integration. That's the new standard. And then I hear people giving arguments like separate but equal in North America. I'm sitting there saying, do you understand how that type of argument goes contrary to the understanding of our world today? Now, I'm not attacking halacha that way. It might be that's the halachic position, because the halachic position is there is a distinction between men and women. But understand the difficulty of that decision. Understand the challenge. And that's something that we don't understand. Now, this becomes complicated, more and more complicated, when you understand what it means to actually function in this society. And that brings up the Portland case. Okay? And that's why I sent around, Corinne sent around the email, this link to the Portland case, which came from Yatid Ne'eman, which is the Aguda publication, because the Portland case was basically, the position of the Kol wives in the Portland case was supported by Agudat Yisrael. Now, what was the case in Portland? There was a man suing for divorce with his wife. Okay, his wife spoke to some Kollel wives. Portland had a Kollel. It was similar to the Kollel that is round up in the Beit here. It's a Kollel that's an active community Kollel. And the wives are involved in talking to the women and so forth. They're also involved. And the Kollel men and the Kollel women both are involved in reaching out to the community and developing the community and so forth and so forth. This wife spoke to a Kollel woman, to two Kollel women, and two Kollel Rebbitzins, and presented, obviously said things to them. And the husband subpoenaed the two wives to share with the court what these women said to what his wife said to these two women. These two women said, we were told that in confidence, and we want to apply the clergy confidential rule that existed in Oregon. Oregon has a rule that says that clergy, right? There's a confidentiality rule for clergy. Clergy do not have to give testimony in court. So these two women argued that they were clergy. Okay? The husband responded, they're not clergy, they're just rebbitins. A rebbitin is simply a woman married to a rabbi. She's not ordained. She doesn't have a position. She doesn't have a clergy position. Okay? She's not clergy. Okay? And therefore the husband said they have to respond to the subpoena. What happened is the judge, happened to be a woman judge, basically said, you know something? Call the two women in. I want to talk to them. And what happened is a brief was presented to the court with the support of a Gudas Yisrael, the social justice division of a Gudas Yisrael got involved to argue that Kol wives were clergy. Okay? Okay, and the court basically said in the end that the legislation is to provide followers of certain religions the right to talk to their clergy with confidentiality. How that religion defines clergy, whether it's ordained or not, is not the function of the legislature. But if this religion, this religious community defines these individuals as clergy, then the court has to recognize them and respect them as clergy and offer them the clergy privilege, the confidentiality privilege. So the court basically decided in favor of the Kol wives that they were clergy and said you don't have to testify. You don't have to testify. That's very nice. So they said that Orthodox Judaism has women clergy, Kol wives. Okay? Now, the fact is though, is if you read all the discussions about women rabbis, is like, can women be clergy and stuff like that, the fact of the matter is you're now dealing with a different definition of clergy. It's not a halachic definition of clergy. The truth of the matter is that one of the things that really gets me about the definition of women rabbis is what exactly is the definition of a rabbi. Okay? And whether the definition of a rabbi that exists in our society is the same as the definition of a rabbi that exists in halacha. And that becomes an issue. Okay, like, what's the prime function of a rabbi? So you talk about pastoral functions. Okay.
To teach.
What? To teach? Is that the function of a rabbi? I mean, the fact is that it becomes an issue. What exactly is the function of a rabbi? And the truth is most functions of rabbis in our synagogues today are not in line with the historical definition of rabbis. If you would have told a rabbi in 1700 that he had to go visit the sick, right, I think it would be like, what are you talking about? If you told a rabbi he had to go do funerals, what are you talking about? Bar mitzvahs? And Moshe thought bar mitzvahs were ridiculous to begin with. Bar mitzvahs is a North American invention. Rabbi involved with a bar mitzvah? Right? A bris? What do you need a rabbi to bris for? So what exactly is the function of a rabbi? Teach? Okay, but do you really need to be a rabbi to teach? So what exactly is the function of the rabbi? Okay? That becomes a real issue. In terms of talking over these things and so forth, what exactly is this issue? Now, it seems to be that the definition of rabbi, okay, when you talk about it in terms of the Gemara, is the right to paskin. Okay? Now, the truth is, though, is that it's actually, if you know the law, you really have the right to paskin. It's just a formal statement by another that you have a right to paskin in order to ensure that the person has been vetted. Okay? In other words, if you are knowledgeable and someone asks you a shaila, you can answer this. You can paskin. The question is that it seems to be that there was some system of letting people know that the person was able to paskin, so that there was a way to let others know. In other words, how do you know I'm able to paskin? So I bring my diploma to show that I know what I'm talking about. Okay? And there were actually some distinctions in specific regards in monetary cases that did not make you culpable for incorrect decisions as a judge. In other words, as a judge, if you misinterpreted the law, if you had the right to decide monetary matters given to you by the Nasi, okay, basically having the authority to make these decisions, then if you made a decision and actually made a mistake, you were not held culpable for that decision. Okay, you didn't have to reimburse the person for his loss. But the fact is that's a much more technical definitions. So the question is, it's true that women were never given over the authority to paskin. Okay, that's true. But then you have another issue. Okay, when were women involved in such heavily advanced study of learning is more. So the fact of the matter is one of the issues that exists today is that there's more study by women on a higher plane than in other years. So the question emerges with wait a second, there's been a revolution in women's education. Now the truth is what people don't recognize is that revolution in women's education itself was revolutionary, and how do you deal with that? So there's large segments of the Orthodox world who still don't have women learning Talmud, but there's large segments of the Orthodox world that has women learning Talmud. The fact of the matter is, if you have so many women learning Talmud, but the truth is though, is one of the problems though, is should you give a woman the authority to paskin? Now the truth is that leads into the issue of leadership. See, one of the functions of a Rav of a community was executive power. Okay, when you really look back to the like I said before, and Ravs today don't really Ravs, because what the Rav really was the executive leader of the community. Okay, when you have a shul today, most times people think the board is really the executive leadership of the shul. Right? Yes, Rabbi halakhic questions, which are usually just ritual questions and so forth and so forth. The fact of the matter is really halakhically, the Rav was the communal leader of the community, and therefore he was involved in taxes, building. I mean, we always like to say about how Judaism doesn't make dissensions and so forth and so forth. The truth of the matter is that every decision in shul is a halachic decision. Whether you want to spend your money on this or that is really a halachic decision. Because the fact is the halacha basically defines the priorities of how you should spend your money. Okay? Including the Reb's salary, which usually should be high. But we won't get into that. The fact is that most people don't recognize that because they think the Rav is just being self-serving, but the fact is, look it up in Shulchan Aruch. But the point is the fact is that, what do you mean? If we're going to have funds to building funds and so forth, why isn't that the role of the Rav? Yeah, okay, you have committees, you have balavatim, so but the Rav is also the executive leader. He may turn around and say, listen, I'm entrusting you to make this decision. I'm trusting you, but the truth of the matter is the Rav is the communal leader of the community, and that's usually where you get into issues of women being rabbis. Is women have a problem in being the communal leader, because the Rambam says women can't be leaders. Now that led into a major question years ago in terms of women being presidents of shuls. The point is, the president of a shul does not have the same kind of power as a king. It's much more of a democrat. It's much more of a. He's not really. The president doesn't really have that kind of power. So therefore, that's the argument says women can be leaders, can be presidents. As other people say, no, the president still is a leader. The fact is, this is really much more where the issue exists in terms of leadership. But the fact is in our world today, in so many shuls today, how many people understand the Rav as being a leader, as being the leader of the community? Okay, the political leader of the community. Okay, which is really what the Rav is. He's not just a person to ask your ritual shalos. He is basically the political leader of your community. And the point is, though, and that might get into issues of women being rabbis in that regard. But the fact is that the question is it? But even when you say, okay, there's halakhic issues like that, then it gets into issues in terms of the role of women and women having a great, and the fact is the egalitarian perspective from the North American perspective, it gets much more complicated. And then you look in terms of the society. And the fact is, the Portland case, it says, wait a second, in our society, we do see aspects of clergy that really affect us from societal definitions. Maybe maybe we have to start calling women clergy, so a woman who can have a function in the shul, even if she's doing pastoral counseling in the shul, you have to give her some kind of clergy function, so this way she can get a housing allowance for taxation purposes. Okay? And the fact is that this all becomes part of the issue, in the sense that, are we looking for the definition of clergy to meet our societal definition, to meet our definition inside the world? And the fact is that, and you look at and a lot of shuls, they advertise for rabbis and rebbitzins. They specifically in their hiring specifically want a couple, right? So it seems to imply that the rebbitzin does have some function in the shul, right? And they obviously the rebbitzin, everyone assumes the rebbitzin, that she's going to be married to a rabbi, is going to have some kind of ability to be a rebbitzin. Okay. It may be true, may not be true, but the fact is that you have some assumption that if the guy's being a rabbi, the rebbitzin is obviously going to have some learning and some understanding of what it means to be a rabbi's wife. The fact is, though, it's a much more complicated issue than and people think it is. But what I really wanted to get to is that first definition and that first issue, which is the fact that we don't recognize the conflict of values that we live with in our own mind. We don't understand that many of our values emerge from other sources than Torah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. The fact is, it might be that you can justify them with Torah. They may open new vistas in Torah. The fact is that, for example, in terms of freedom of religion, the truth is that I have a whole argument for why freedom of religion is a Torah value, based upon Rashi. Okay? Rashi makes an unbelievable statement in regard to. I saw it, and I saw Norman Lamb says something very similar in his book about faith and doubt. But the fact is that there's famous case. There's three famous cases of non-Jews who approach Hillel and Shammai to become Jews. The most famous of them is the fact the person says, "I want to become a Jew. Teach me all of Torah when I'm standing on one leg." Rashi kicks him out. Beis Shammai kicks him out. Beis Hillel says, "Haftarecha kamocha." That's all of Torah. By the way, if you look at Rashi there, Rashi gives two different definitions of Haftarecha kamocha. One definition is the way that everyone says it. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's a great ethical law. That's the real essence of Torah. The other definition of Rashi is no. Who's your Reyecha? It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Love God. That's really the essence of Torah. Okay? And everything else is commentary. That's another pshat in Rashi over there. Okay. The fact is, though, that's one definition. There's two other cases of non-Jews of a non-Jew who wants to convert. One case of a non-Jew who wants to convert is a non-Jew who hears about how great it is to be Kohen Gadol, and he says, "Convert me on condition I become Kohen Gadol." You guys all know this story? He said, "Convert me on the condition to become Kohen Gadol." Shammai kicks him out. Hillel says, "Okay." Okay. Now there's actually machlokas here in what happened. There's actually different proportion about how it happened here. The Gemara actually says he converted him. Okay, he converted him, and he taught him, and then he said, now if you want to become Kohen Gadol, you got to learn about what it means to be Kohen Gadol. So the guy went off to learn to become Kohen Gadol, and he said, and he comes across a pasuk that says, "Zar ha'ikaret yamut," that a person who's a stranger with this non-Kohen, if he sacrifices, will die. And he goes to Hillel and says, "Who are they talking about that gets killed if he brings sacrifices?" And Hillel says, even if David HaMelech brought a sacrifice, he is a czar and he would be killed. So, and the non-Jew recognized he could never be Kohen Gadol. So he said, "Okay, I can't be Kohen Gadol." But the language of the Gemara is he converted him and then taught him. Now, if that's true, the guy converted on the condition with an idea that he could become Kohen Gadol. Right? He converted with a misunderstanding of Torah. Right? Which means he converted without accepting all the mitzvot. Because he thought that when he converted that it's okay for him to be Kohen Gadol. Keep that in mind. Now, the truth is, there's another viewpoint in that Gemara. It's from Marsha. The Marsha says no, even though the language says he converted him first, really that Hillel taught him these psukim first, and only afterwards, when the guy understood he couldn't become Kohen Gadol, that's when Hillel converted him. That's the Marsha. And the Marsha says you learn from there that it's okay to teach a non-Jew Torah on the condition he wants to convert, because generally you're not allowed to teach a non-Jew Torah, but it's okay to teach a non-Jew Torah if he wants to convert. Okay, that's the Marsha. But he basically says, why? Because the Marsha is bothered. How could he not teach him Torah first? Okay. But the fact is Rashi actually gives another answer in the third case, which seems to imply that Rashi says it's okay to convert a person even if he has a misunderstanding of what the halacha is. That case is like this. Another non-Jew comes to Hillel and Shammai and says, "I want to convert on the condition." He says, the non-Jew comes and says, "How many Torahs are there?" So Shammai says, "There's two Torahs." Both of them, Hillel and Shammai, both say there's two Torahs. There's Torah Shebechtav and Torah Shebal Peh. So written Torah and the oral Torah. So the non-Jew says, "I want to convert on condition that I only accept the written Torah, I don't accept the oral Torah." So Shammai kicks him out. Okay, what do you call a person who only accepts the written Torah and not the oral Torah? That person is a Sadducee in the time of Hillel and Shammai. Okay, a Sadducee is not within the parameters of Orthodox Judaism. The Rambam clearly calls a Sadducee a heretic. So Shammai basically says, "Get out of here. You're not going to be Makabel Mitzvahs, you don't know." Okay, comes to Hillel, and Hillel says, "Okay." And he converts it on condition. Okay, he converts it on the condition he only believes in Torah Shebechtav and not Torah Shebal Peh. Even though that obviously means that the person, okay, has heretical ideas and also has incorrect understandings of halacha, because the Sadducees had incorrect understandings of halacha. Okay, so Rashi deals with that, because we have a concept in halacha that says if a person wants to convert, he can't convert while denying a halacha. Right? chutz midavar echad. You can't convert if you don't believe. If you say I'm denying one law. So Hillel says. But Hillel converted him. So Hillel converted him because Hillel believed that eventually he would educate this guy and the guy would get it right and that would be all right. So he converted him knowing full well, believing in himself that eventually he can get this guy to believe correctly. But at the time of the conversion he didn't believe correctly. It's a classic argument to show the power of Bezdin to convert that is much broader than the way a lot of people think it is. Anyways, that's what Rashi says. Okay. The point is, though, is with that understanding, converted him and so forth. The fact is, the guy still did not accept all of Torah. Now, where am I going with this? So the point is that going back to that Kohen Gadol thing and so forth, what I'm trying to say is this raises the issue in terms of a person who doesn't fully understand the belief and so forth. So, how can that person be accepted as a fully understanding Jew? So the truth is that Hill basically, the argument of Rashi is, there's a difference between someone who absolutely denies a principle of Judaism or just doesn't know it, or just doesn't believe it. To really be a person who denies is to say, absolutely, I think this is false, and so forth and so forth. But he just doesn't believe it, he doesn't know for sure. That's acceptable. That's a more acceptable idea. So the fact is in terms of our understanding of values and concepts like that, the point is that values really work within a world of our understanding. Okay, and trying to understand them and so forth and so forth. And if you're living in this world of understanding, that's what really tied into Rabbi Lamb's argument of faith and doubt, is that if you're trying to work it out and so forth, you're not denying it. You're not adamant for one cause, but you're trying to work it out, you're trying to balance these different things, then that is an argument for the system. So the point is that that's an argument for freedom of religion, which is where I wanted to get to. What Rashi is really telling you is that Judaism does have a concept of freedom of religion. Unless you're, because the fact is, what it really is freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is if a person is adamant about believing in something. Judaism is not too happy about that freedom of religion of someone who's basically dogmatic. But a person who's struggling with trying to figure out things and trying to work with things, abides by this thought today, disagrees with that, finds questions with it, but he understands the flux of trying to understand the truth when there's no absolute indication of the truth. Judaism understands that dilemma, and therefore it has an aspect of freedom of religion. That's our world today. There's no absolute proof there's no absolute miracles which can prove God's existence. So the point is, someone is struggling with what's the truth and sort of ideas. So now he's into this religion, but he understands. This is what I think now. This is where I come to this conclusion. It's not because I'm declaring it dogmatically. It's because I'm struggling because I don't have an absolute argument. Judaism says, okay, we can understand that. And that seems to be what Rashi is pointing to. That's just, since I mentioned the aspect of freedom of religion, Judaism has that aspect of religion for the person who's trying to think out things. Okay, it doesn't have too much attitude for dogmatism, which means why Judaism wouldn't be too, why halacha would not be too understanding of dogmatic, like ISIS and this dogmatism. Okay, the truth is, it's a very strong attitude, and this is what Rabbi Lamb is pointing out in his book, Faith and Doubt. There's a very strong value in doubt, because it makes you understand the issues that you have to deal with. Anyways, that's a different issue. Okay, but the point is that that comes about from the struggle that originated from my trying to understand how freedom of religion can be a value within Torah, because I do see the value of freedom of religion. I was brought up with the value of freedom of religion. Anyways, so that's part of the issue. That's really part of this whole issue with women rabbis. We're living in a world of tremendous flux and a lot of different attitudes. And the fact is what I find is no one is really dealing with it in its full capacity in terms of dialogue. One of the things that drives me crazy in everything I've seen on the issue of women rabbis, both from the left and from the right, is that their presentations are all dogmatic. I would like to hear someone on either side say, here's the argument against me. Okay? I saw this in Avi Weiss's article in Jewish Week. Come on! You know they have so many rabbis against you, and the fact you're making it seem like it's so simple that I'm right. Come on! If you want to give an argument, let me hear the argument against you. Let's understand its difficulty. Let's understand why you made this choice versus that choice and the difficulty of it, and so forth and so forth. And let me hear it from the right as well. Nowadays, no one ever quotes the other side, which always bothers me, because we still always quote Beit Shammai first. Anyways, but there haven't been any questions here. I just feel I've been talking and talking and talking.
So
you have a question?
It's all interesting.
Yes.
From the Portland from the article on the Portland case.
Yeah.
It seemed that the depositions that the Rabbi gave to the court specifically said that these women are not serving a religious function. What they are is they are people from the community would know that they would come to them and tell things in confidence, the same that they would tell to a rabbi. So they would deal with personal problems in that fashion,
right.
expecting confidence. The judge then ruled, under the state's law, by the definition of what they wanted to define as clergy, is somebody who you're going to tell somebody to get moral guidance and advice from, and with an expectation of confidence. That's how we wanted to define clergy under the law. So under the state of Oregon law, they fit the definition of clergy without actually declaring them clergy.
The expectation part.
The fact is,
sense in any way.
But her statement is if the religious group defines them as clergy, that's their definition of clergy. See, the problem is that
wasn't deciding.
What?
The judge wasn't deciding.
No, do you have the article there?
The article is here.
Okay, I'll read.
The judge was defining what they felt the law meant by clergy. Under the state of Oregon law,
yeah,
it has nothing to do with what Judaism would define as clergy or not.
No, it does. It basically does. What it says is that the way the religious group defines clergy, okay, the court's not going to tell a religious grouping how it defines clergy, whether it has to be ordained or not ordained or so forth and so forth. But if a religious group defines a certain grouping as clergy, then the state should recognize that group as clergy. But the truth is, go in the Shulchan Aruch and see if you see the English word clergy written by any of the major voices in the Shulchan Aruch. You're talking about a definition of a term that is not a halachic term. It's a North American term. But the problem is, it's a term that we have to deal with, which affects us because we want women rebbetzins to be perceived as clergy. We don't want to be, but not from we want them to perceive them to be clergy pursuant to what they think clergy is about. But the fact is that standard, that definition really is not a halachic definition. So you're right. It's basically saying if this grouping defines this group as clergy, if this religious grouping defines this group as clergy, then we should recognize that clergy. But what they're saying is this religious grouping is defining as clergy. It's clergy for our purposes, or what we think clergy is for our purposes. But the group itself may not actually have a role for clergy. See, it was interesting the women pointed out something The fact of the matter is the confidentiality rule that applies to the women, when they talk in halacha, they can't repeat themselves. The truth of the matter is that halachic standard applies to all Jews. You know, it's an interesting issue. It's an interesting issue, for example, in terms of doctors. Okay? One of the difficulties in talking about medical ethics from a halachic perspective is a lot of times within medical ethics, within secular medical ethics, they'll talk about the ethics of a doctor under the Hippocratic Oath or something like that, or a doctor has certain ethical issues and so forth and so forth. When you get into the halachic definition of medical ethics, there is no distinction between a doctor and any other Jew. Okay? The difference between myself and Jeff is only the fact that Jeff has knowledge that I don't have. We have the exact same obligation. Okay? As the Vilna Gaon pointed out, he stopped his medical education because he felt that if he ever fully completed his studies in medicine, he'd never be able to learn Torah again. Because he'd always have the obligation to go treat someone. But the fact of the matter is that there's no distinction in halachic medical ethics between a doctor and a layman, except for the fact the doctor has that knowledge. It's not his profession, it's the fact he has that knowledge. He has to do pursuant to that knowledge. Okay, I don't have that knowledge, therefore I don't have a similar obligation. But the obligation, the actual moral obligation, is exactly the same. Now the truth is that's really what the women argued in terms of their confidentiality. Their confidentiality, the classic starting point for all the discussion about clergy confidentiality is the Catholic confession, right? Because the fact of the matter is a priest can't reveal his confession, but the fact his confession is only a specific function of a priest. And that's why clergy becomes the big issue, that if you're told clergy, and then people go into the, and so that's where it got into the thing where it started, that's where it started from, and then it got extended from there. There was times where the only people who had confidentiality was ordained Catholic priests, because that was so fundamental to the religious perspective. But the truth is, halacha, what the women argued halachically is their obligation of confidentiality was simply the same halachic obligation of any Jew who was told something in confidence. Right? No, everyone here would have the same, under halacha, you would have the same obligation to keep quiet, right? Whether you were clergy or not. The point is, though, is that they turned to clergy as a argument, because that's the argument within the court system. But the fact is that you're getting into the issue that the clergy definition is their definition, but they said this group gave this group, the religious group gave this group that definition. But the fact is that shows the difficulty with it, in the sense that what's happening in a lot of the shuls that are opening themselves up to women, like the issues like with the Yetzet Halacha. In the RCA definition, they make a major distinction between the Yetzet Halacha and the Maharat from Maharat being from Yeshivat Maharat, the Open Orthodox women's school, and the Yetzet Halacha, which comes out of Nishma, which is much more accepted within the more mainstream, let's say, modern Orthodoxy or whatever. And the fact is, though, is what's the distinction. So there's real issues with what that distinction is. The fact is, how that distinction is defined is so difficult, because when Rabbi Riskin, Rabbi Steve Riskin, who ordained women in Israel, he basically gives a certain level of smicha to women in Israel. When he heard the RCA decision, he felt that his ordinations were included in the attack of the resolution. The resolution also challenged what he was doing. Okay, even though the resolution made an absolute distinction between Yetzet Halacha and Maharat, but Steve Riskin understood that. Riskin understood that that he was in the same category of the women that were being challenged by that resolution. The fact is that it seems to me that there is a distinction halakha between men and women in this area, but then you better be very, very clear what that distinction is, and that is what is demanded, okay? And you need real clarity because it's such a sticky area.
Where is this going, though?
What?
This debate.
In the States, it's going into the possible schism within Orthodoxy. You see, this actually was an issue that was brought up a couple years ago with Chovei Torah, where Yetid Naaman published an article that basically said that Chovei Torah, which is the flagship yeshiva of open Orthodoxy, is really the new conservatives. Conservative Judaism, when it began in the 1800s, was a very strong, was perceived itself to be a halakhic entity. Its understanding of the halakhic process was different than classic Orthodoxy. The truth is, it was very, very hard to really draw the line. We all think of the conservatives as individuals in North America, in terms of the Jewish Theological Seminary and so forth and so forth. But conservative Judaism really began with the historical school in Europe. And the major flagship yeshiva of the historical school was Breslau, okay, in Germany, okay? The Breslau Seminary in Germany was the major entity of historical Judaism. Historical Judaism main scholar was a person by the name of Zachariah Frankel. Okay? Tremendous controversy about Zachariah Frankel. Zachariah Frankel, if you would walk into this room right now, you would think was a chassid. Always walked around with a bekesh. He wouldn't be a chassid, he'd be more like a Lithuanian Jew. Walked around with a long kapota, you know. He clearly knew his stuff. The fact of the matter is that he was radical in his thoughts because of the historical school, but he was someone who was pretty mukbid in a lot of halachas. It led to a tremendous controversy over what was his philosophy really outside the pale or not. That seems to be a disagreement between Rav Shimshon Hirsch and Rabbi Zil Hildesheimer. Zil Hildesheimer was the head of the Hildesheimer Academy, Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin, and the head of what was called Berlin Orthodoxy. Shimshon Hirsch, of course, was the head of the Frankfurt community, and he was the head of what was called the Frankfurt Orthodoxy. A lot of people think that Shimshon Hirsch was the father of modern Orthodoxy. The fact of the matter is both him and Israel Hildesheimer were both involved in the integration of secular ideas with Torah. The truth is Israel Hildesheimer was had much more integration, especially in terms of the two subsequent Rosh Hashivas of the Hildesheimer Seminary. The one person who followed with Israel Hildesheimer was David Zvi Frank. What's his name? I can't believe it just went. I think David Zvi Frankel because maybe it was Zachariah Frankel. Was the Melamed Lahoyel, who was a major posek in Germany, and I can't believe I forgot his name. And the other person who followed him was Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, who was the Sfridi Eish, who was a major Gadol in the 60s. He was major Gadol. He was accepted by the entire Orthodox world. The other person also, the Melamed Lahoyel, was also accepted by the Orthodox world. Israel Hildesheimer was accepted by the Orthodox world. But Israel Hildesheimer and Shimshon Hirsch had some disagreements in the integration of secular studies with Torah. Shimshon Hirsch actually was much more aligned with the Aguda world. Eventually, the Frankfurt school eventually became integrated with Aguda, okay, and had very strong attitudes, especially in terms of Zionism, where it had nothing to do with secular Zionism. The fact that Aguda had nothing to do with secular Zionism, there's arguments that there seems to be that's because of the followers of Shimshon Hirsch. Anyways, there's clear that if Shimshon Hirsch held that Zachariah Frankel was outside the pale. It's clear. He wrote about it and he said he's not vicarious. Clearly. There's people who then tried to defend him and so forth and so forth. There's a little bit of a controversy about what Israel Hildesheimer felt about Zachariah Frankel. The fact is that there is some correspondence that was found in the 1860s between where it seems that Israel Hildesheimer wrote about a Rabbi Frankel and called him, or wrote about a guy called Frankel and said this guy is completely a min and totally wrong, and we got to do everything we can to kick him out of the community. Okay, and a lot of people say, gee, he must have also felt this way about Zachariah Frankel. Then there was an article written in Tradition that said that if you really research the historical facts, you find that Israel Hildesheimer was actually talking about a Meshumad missionary, a Jewish missionary, like a Jews for Jesus guy named Frankel, and that's who he was talking about. The fact is, there's correspondence between Israel Hildesheimer and Zachariah Frankel, where Israel Hildesheimer wrote him Harav Hagayim. Okay, so now we don't really know how you now, and this gets into a lot of issues. Okay, Mark Shapiro just came out with a book about, for example, Shaul Lieberman. Shaul Lieberman was also, I mean, everyone argues much more that Shaul Lieberman was a frum guy. But the fact of the matter is, it's clear that there's correspondence from Pinchas Hirschfeld, Chief Rabbi Mencha. There's correspondence from Rav Soloveitchik, who wrote Shaul Lieberman and basically wrote him as a Rav Hagon. So he didn't think, it's clear that he didn't think he was on the curse. So the fact is that the leaders of the conservative movement, when the conservative movement was much more halachic, it's really hard to pinpoint it. Okay, it's really, really hard. Now, the point is, though, it's clear the conservative movement went far away, and the fact is, but in the early 1900s, you had people going back between YU and JTS. You had professors, a guy who taught Gemara in JTS, and eventually ended up teaching Gemara at YU. Right, so the fact that, and there was even discussions about YU and JTS merging in the early part of the 20th century. There was discussions in the mid part of the 20th century to work out a common Beit-Din between the RA and the RCA. Okay, whole book about that by Rabbi Bernstein, where he basically talks about the whole issue where the RA is the rabbinical body of the conservative movement, and the RCA. And eventually it was negotiated between the Rav and Shaul Lieberman, and basically the Rav said, here's the position, and Shaul Lieberman said, I can't deliver on that. These people aren't going to believe it, and basically the whole idea fell down. But there was actually an attempt to create a unified Bezdin between the RCA and the RA. So the truth is, that dividing line is very simple. The only thing is, though, that conservative movement never had a laity. There were some people, for whatever reasons, were basically from, and they had radical ideas, but they never had a laity. There was never a conservative laity. When a person went to a conservative shul, how many people who went to a conservative shul, everyone says they drive to shul on Shabbos. How many people actually followed the conservative psak about driving on Shabbos, which is you're only allowed to drive to shul and home on Shabbos, or for a dvar mitzvah? Why? Because in technical terms, the conservatives argued that driving on Shabbos was a shvus to shvus, and a shvus to shvus is mutter b'makom mitzvah. Yes, we can explain what that means. What the conservatives did is, pursuant to their halachic analysis, they said that the driving to shul on Shabbos is only a violation of a rabbinic commandment within a rabbinic commandment, and two rabbinic commandments like that can be overridden in the pursuit of doing a mitzvah. So let me tell you an example where I've used that rule. Okay? Shvus l'shvus l'maka mitzvah. What is it? Is that, for example, I had a caterer in my shul, okay, in Kingston, New York, right, who wished to have a luncheon in the shul on Shabbos, which would have been unique because in that shul, to have the shul having luncheons on Shabbos, usually people, the shul is mostly not from people. There's people would basically have the bar mitzvah in the shul, then they'd go off to some hotel in the area and have their meal. Okay, so this catering company was going to make the meal in the shul, but in order to make that meal acceptable to people in terms of trying to sell the meal to people, the meal had to be warm, and it couldn't be left in overnight because what they wanted had to be something put back in the oven. So the question emerged: how can we get it that we can put food into the oven on Shabbos? Okay, so the truth of the matter is putting food in an oven on Shabbos, okay, when the food is already cooked and totally solid, warming up food on Shabbos in the D'Rabbanan. Okay? Now, I still can't do an D'Rabbanan in terms of a mitzvah. But if I can make it two Isuri D'Rabbanans, okay, built on each other, I can. So guess what? Amir La'akum, telling a non-Jew to do something that's forbidden on Shabbos, is an Isur D'Rabbanan. So if I tell a non-Jew to put that food into the oven on Shabbos, I am doing what's called, now I can't do that for no reason. That's still shvus t'shvus. It's telling a non-Jew to still violate Shabbos. But I can tell. But if I have a non-Jew, which is a prohibition of Shabbos, right, an Isur D'Rabbanan, rabbinic prohibition, telling a non-Jew to do something, and what you're telling him to do is another rabbinic prohibition, that's called a shvus t'shvus. And b'makom mitzvah, you can do that. And for me to have luncheons in the shul on Shabbos, and therefore not getting these bar mitzvahs going out to some treif place in the mountains, and actually keeping them in the shul building on Shabbos, and not being mechal Shabbos by driving somewhere, and have to, that for sure is a makom mitzvah. I also checked out other rabbis who said, yes, absolutely, you're correct. The fact of the matter is that that's an example of shvus. What did the conservative movement argue? They argued that the driving of a car is a shvus t'shvus, right? Was only rabbinic prohibition of a rabbinic prohibition, right? And that for makom mitzvah, driving to shul, it was mutter. That was their argument. Now, the truth of the matter is, their argument that it was a shvus t'shvus is where orthodoxy went crazy. Their arguments are basically not acceptable from the technical analysis of orthodoxy, but they were working within the system. Okay? Now, the truth of the matter is, how many people within the conservative movement would therefore say, I only drive to shul on Shabbos because I'm following the halacha? Very little, no one. Conservative Jews, there wasn't a lady, but now we have a new world. We have a laity that's attached to open orthodoxy. There are many, many individuals who define themselves as orthodox and are absolutely careful about halacha from an orthodox perspective, who belong to synagogues that are connected to what we would call open orthodoxy. And these are individuals who are absolutely committed to halacha. They'll take the decisions of halacha of open orthodoxy as acceptable decisions. Okay, what happens is, though, is that's creating a tremendous issue. Because what you now find is that you have other elements within the Orthodox world, such as Agudas Yisrael, who is very adamant about declaring open orthodoxy outside the pale. So what they're basically saying is that this whole segment of Orthodox, of what we have seen till now, or we recognize till now as Orthodox laity, individuals that keep Shabbos, individuals that are interested in following Allah, but turn to a certain rabbis for halachic decisions, right, being declared by a certain segment of orthodoxy as not really orthodox. They're really conservative in terms of that separation in halacha that existed between the conservative and the Orthodox in the original in the 1800s, in this original formation of the distinction. Now the problem is, though, my own perspective is that really is, now you're not seeing this in Toronto yet, but this is becoming issues in the States, and it could become an issue here in Toronto very soon, in terms of schisms between Orthodox people. And you'll have people who Shomer Shabbos and so forth, but you can't eat that person's house because there's a schism between these two groups now. Now the point is, though, is that these are all issues, and the reason is because we're not even dialoguing between this. Okay. Now the truth is I think that there are problems because no one is able to argue the other side. There's so much. It gets me upset that there's so much possession arguing the side. And my one critique of open orthodoxy, okay, is that they are fostering the schism because they have to draw the line where they draw the line. There's certain positions within open orthodoxy that everyone within orthodoxy thinks is outside the pale. Okay, except for these few individuals in open orthodoxy who, like for example, I think that open orthodoxy needs to be very adamant in its position vis-a-vis homosexuality, because there is a strong segment, there's a strong perception in the United States that maintains that homosexuality on some level is permitted within orthodoxy. There are people who basically, if it's like remarkable how some people just say it. They'll just say, we all know that the absolute rejection of all homosexuality is not really a halachic position, but there's only certain things which are forbidden, other things are okay, and therefore we can be much more welcoming of homosexual couples within orthodoxy. That argument has no halachic basis. Okay, that really has no halachic basis. But some guy threw out an argument in his. It's an argument that comes from Steve Greenberg, who got smicha from YU and came out openly gay and now has a partner and so forth. He's developed his argument why it's okay for him to have a partner and do certain things and not other things. And if you read his argument, the argument has no validity from an Orthodox perspective. The point is, though, is that it's my argument that my position is that open orthodoxy really has to draw the line, because there are certain open orthodox rabbis who are buying into that argument, and that really creates feed to the schism. You got to draw the line somewhere. Okay. Anyway, so I'm going a little bit, but that's really an issue. That's what's going to happen to orthodoxy. That's really the issue. It's not happening in Toronto. We're Canadian. We're always 20 years behind, right? But the fact is, it is happening in the States. And listen, Montreal does have a woman rabbi. Okay, in the Shar Shemayim synagogue there is a woman rabbi. The fact is that it's becoming it's not in Toronto. And the fact is that the issue is a very powerful issue, because there's a lot of tension on the issue, because the Yoetz HaHalacha and there's going to be pressure on limiting the Yoetz HaHalacha. There's a lot of pressure which will affect women learning. I saw one major, what you would call modern Orthodox figure basically argue that the study of Talmud by women was never meant to be so extensive. That really a mistake was made within modern orthodoxy that basically said that women should study Talmud so much. It was never meant to be that way. How this person understands the rub, I don't understand, but okay. But the fact of the matter is that that's an example in terms of women's education. There's going to be a potential, what do you call it, backlash that's then going to put limitations on women's education
What do you
in this
see as
argument.
the social implications of all this to the Orthodox community?
Orthodoxy is becoming much more fragmentized.
More what?
Fragmentized. Okay, fragmented. You saw of how fragmented we are in response to the whole Slifkin affair, which had nothing to do with practice. It was ideas, okay, and Rabbi Slifkin himself was pretty much of a frum guy in his behavior and so forth and so forth. And the fact is that there's fragmentation within the Orthodox world. And that fragmentation is creating rifts. I mean, when I was growing up, everyone knew that Moshe and the Rav were cousins and had tremendous respect for each other. Okay? And everyone knew the Rav was a gadol and Moshe was a gadol, and they disagreed. But say something bad about the Rav in front of Moshe, and you'll get killed. Say something bad about Moshe in front of the Rav, you get killed. There's a certain, it's a very interesting thing that I read somewhere. People think that the rifts that are happening to the Haredim and the Dati Lumi in Israel, these rifts were always there. I read someone say, do you think that Rav Sonnenfeld and Rav Kook had these rifts? Rav Sonnenfeld and Rav Kook, the actual thinkers themselves, the radical thinker of the Raya Kook, and Rav Chaim Yosef Sonnenfeld, who was the bastion of the tradition. Okay, so everyone thinks back there and says, "Oh wow, they must have really been in each other." They went around Europe. They went around Israel together, right? Rav Kook walked away. There's a story. Rav Kook was walking away from the Kosel, and Rav Sonnenfeld was coming to the Kosel. Rav Sonnenfeld said to Rav Kook, "May your feet soon be covered with blood." And these Talmidim of the Raya Kook were, how can he say that? He says, "What are you, an idiot? Because I'm a Kohen." He said, "Soon you should be Makov Karbanis in the Beis Hamikdash." Right? I mean, what do you think? Get in disagreements. Now, I point this out many times. The mother of Rav Soloveitchik was a Feinstein, Heskia Feinstein. Her father was a big gun in in Europe. Okay, Rabbi Feinstein, obviously related to the Feinstein family. That's how the Rav was cousins with Moshe. He was one of the major advocates of introducing secular studies in Volozhin. Volozhin was the big yeshiva in Europe, and there was a big battle of whether the Russian government said we want to introduce secular studies into Volozhin. It's a big argument among rabbis. Do we let secular studies in or not? So one of the major proponents for secular studies was Rav Feinstein. Another major proponent for secular studies was the Aruch HaShulchan. There are major people on the side who say yes, we need to have secular studies in Volozhin. Satisfy the Russian government request. In fact, there's even reasons for it. Make our rabbis more accepted because they'll know Russian and so forth and so forth. There were some people who were very much against secular studies. Okay, Lubavitcher was very much against secular studies. One of the major people against was Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, right? The grandfather of Rabbi Soloveitchik. He's very much against secular studies in Volozhin. So you had this battle between Gedolei Yisrael. Okay? So the argument is someone came to Rav Chaim and said, last story that I'll get to. Okay, Rav Chaim said, I got a great shidduch for Rav Chaim's son. It was Rav Moshe Soloveitchik and Pessi Feinstein. Rabbi Feinstein's daughter. And they said, "Are you crazy? Rav Chaim would never accept that shidduch. You want to go to Rav Chaim and say, take the guy who's pro-secular studies, but Rav Chaim was anti-secular studies, and you want to set up the shidduch? people were saying, "No, I'm going to go to Reb Chaim." Came to Reb Chaim and said, "Got a shidduch for you?" "Oh, excellent! So Talmud Chacham is good." He accepted the shidduch. Right? Then when his father, then when someone to get married, he said, "Listen, you're going to go stay by your father-in-law, and you should know that his Shabbos table is going to be a little bit different than ours." The truth is that the Shabbos table they would actually mention Tolstoy. Something like that. In fact, it was the Rav himself said they learned Tolstoy from his mother. So and supposedly in the first little while then getting married, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, this is in Mrs. Meiselman's book. Mrs. Meiselman is Moshe Meiselman's mother. I forget her name, but she's the Rav's sister, and she wrote a book called I think the Soloveitchik Heritage, and he basically said that the first few months that her father stayed at he couldn't take it after a while because the Shabbos table they started talking all these secular things. He's like, and he went back home, and Reb Chaim sat down with him and says, "I know it's difficult, it's different, but go back to your wife." But the fact of the matter is you had from this world to that world. Where do you ever hear that today? That the Rosh Yeshiva of this Haredi Yeshiva is going to make a shidduch with one of the daughters of one of the Rosh Yeshivas of YU. What? Unless that daughter has already become a Haredi. The point is that's what there's fragmentation happening within the Orthodox world, and it's growing and growing. I feel it in Toronto. The fact that there's this fragmentation in Toronto, and that's why there's little. When Rafelder was here, it was a much more unified community.
That is true.
Okay, and the fact is that, and the fact is that these are the forces of fragmentation, and if we don't know how to deal with it, and by the way, one of the problems is knowing where fragmentation is necessary. Listen, just because this is one of the arguments, that happens with open orthodoxy. Yeah, you want to be open, but you can't be open to everyone. There's a story with Avi Weiss that he wanted to have this big open orthodoxy with, last story. This one big open orthodoxy on Simchas Torah, where he wanted to invite all the synagogues in Riverdale to dance together at Simchas Torah, right? Very nice idea. So conservative and reform temples on Simchas Torah night where everyone's there, we'll all go out into the streets and we'll all dance. It was great. Until the Reformed Temple women in the Reformed Temple try to join the men circle, and Rice said, "Wait a second, we still can't have mixed dancing." And no, what are you talking about? Men and women together. And he had to retreat. He had to take he risked it away. Truth of the matter is there's going to be a line drawn by Orthodoxy. You're not going to accept everything. So the fact is that the point is knowing where the fragmentation is outside the pale, and when we have disagreements within the pale, and how we live with disagreements within the pale. Nowadays, people don't know how to live with disagreements within the pale, and that's really what's coming out. Now, this is not to say that I'm in agreement with everything that stands. You got to know where you're dividing the line, and then you have to know how to relate within the pale. And what's happening now is this greater fragmentation because no one knows how to deal with anyone who disagrees within the pale. Okay.
Thank you. You were already grown up, but your rabbi and mine, Rabbi Bulka, in the early 1980s wrote a book called The Coming Cataclysm.
Yes.
Coming is now.
Rabbi,
we are facing that schism.
Rabbi Bulka's book.
In the face.
Rabbi Bulka's book called The Coming Cataclysm was dealing with the separation of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodoxy, and the problem with Gerus. The fact is that who is a Jew? If you deal in the street, patrilineal descent makes a lot of people Jewish who are not halakhically Jewish, and a lot of times when people talk about being Jewish or not, we don't know who's Jewish anymore from a halachic perspective. That woman congresswoman from Arizona, who was Jewish. Everyone talked to her being Jewish, and and there was an assassination attempt against her and stuff like that, and all these things about her. The fact is, she was very much involved in the Jewish community. She was actually a leader in a Reformed temple. She was not halakhically Jewish, but everyone talked to her just in the press as being Jewish. Fact is we don't recognize that. That's what Rabbi Bulka was talking about, the coming cataclysm, where we won't even know what we are in terms of being Jewish. And that's a problem now that exists in Israel. And one of the issues you have in Israel is that you have a lot of people in Israel who perceive themselves to be Jewish who really aren't halachically Jewish, and you don't know what's going to happen in the next generation. Right? Because they are from one aspect of Israeli law Jewish, and from another aspect they aren't. Under the law of return they're accepted as Jewish, now, but they're not halachically Jewish, and then you have real problems. What's going to happen? And that's why you have issues where there's a lot of pressure not to have marriage and divorce just in the hands of the rabbinate. You need a secular thing because there's a lot of people in Israel who can't get married by the rabbinate, by the rabbinut, because they're not Jewish, and then who's going to marry them? Because there's no other religion there, and therefore you have pressure to have conservative and Reform Judaism now becoming religions within Israel. But the point is that's fragmentation that's happening. That's Rabbi Bulka's argument, and he's right. There's issues in terms of the Jewish community. What's happening also is issues in terms of the Orthodox community and fragmentation within the Orthodox community.
So can I address that as well?
Yes.
Maybe questions or insights.
Yes.
Well, I want to go back actually to the first subject that you were talking about. Does Judaism have freedom of religion? No, it doesn't. In the sense of Torah having Torah for Jews, and for non-Jews, there's Shavim Mitzvot B'nai Noach.
Yes.
That's it.
Yes.
How that's led to
freedom
what exists in the world.
Okay.
What exists in the world exists in the world.
Judaism believes freedom of religion. Judaism does not believe that anyone can choose whatever religion they want to. Judaism believes that there is a truth, and we would like it. We think it's an ideal if everyone recognized that truth. Okay? But now, the eventual idea of Mashiach from one perspective, more universal perspective, is that everyone will eventually understand the truth of Torah, which includes the truth of God, an understanding of God as the God of Sinai and His directions distinctive between Jew and non-Jew.
So
what freedom of religion is how you understand someone who doesn't have that belief. Okay, what's our attitude to someone who doesn't have that belief? So Torquemada's attitude to that belief was the fact that if you don't have the belief of Christianity, you're a heretic. So he basically said that then you go to hell. What I'm arguing for freedom of religion is Judaism says to someone who doesn't have that belief, we're not basically going to say that everyone who doesn't have that belief is going to hell. And therefore, given our world today, how do we relate to people who have different viewpoints? Yes, there's an ideal everyone should, but that's the ideal of Mashiach. We can't prove our point now, so how do we relate to people? That's what freedom of religion is about. Okay, from a more behavioral aspect, it doesn't. The idea that freedom of religion says all religions are true. It's not. That's why there's a strong argument that freedom of religion was really began by atheists. The whole thing's a joke anyway. So, if people want to believe that, as long as they don't cause any problems, we'll let them believe it. Seems to be Thomas Paine's attitude towards freedom of religion. And there's arguments that Jefferson really had that attitude, even though he told people he was Christian. But the point is, and there's issues about Rousseau, was he really religious Catholic or not? He might have also been an atheist. Voltaire most likely was an atheist. The fact is, freedom of religion usually came about from people who basically say, here's the truth, but if people want to not deal with the truth, let's be tolerant of them. Okay, so Judaism has a similar idea, with one caveat. People have responsibility to try and figure out what is right and wrong. That's a caveat within from Torah. Okay, yeah, you have another point, it seems.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, we have. Arthur has. I'm sorry.
Totally separate issue.
Yes.
Could you give me an example of someone who is not considered Jewish, halachically Jewish,
Yeah.
but who thinks they are?
That congresswoman. That congresswoman who.
He's asking, so how isn't she halachically Jewish?
Because her mother was
Her
not Jewish.
matrilineal
Because
descent.
his mother was not
Right.
Jewish.
Her mother was not.
Okay. I mean,
She could convert. She could become Jewish.
let
No,
me.
but that's the
I can
answer
think
to
of
my-
another. I'm trying to think of
that's a
another
good answer to
example.
my question.
Okay, I can think of another example. Trying to think of another example of someone
The
who.
Falashas,
Falashas become a halachic
Russian?
issue. Yeah, Russians. And there was one of the issues matrilineal. You said the other issue is whether the conversions. Now, there's a whole case I read about in Israel today of a woman who was declared 30 years ago that her conversion wasn't good. So now her daughter is fighting against in court because it's affecting the status of her daughter. Okay? Because if the mother wasn't Jewish, if the grandmother wasn't Jewish, then she's not Jewish, and her daughter's not Jewish, and she's upset about that. Because some court overturned and said this conversion done 30 years ago was not a good conversion. Now we did find that case within Mel Falkenheim's. That was a famous case of Mel Falkenheim's son, because the argument was Mel Falkenheim's wife was not Jewish, and there were some challenges about her conversion, and there was this court in Israel who said, you're right, wasn't a good conversion, therefore he's not Jewish, and so forth. There becomes issues like this. And
then they ushered the conversions of a particular Rav.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then a whole group of people were affected.
So the fact is, you have a lot of people who end up not being because their conversions were good, but a lot from matrilineal descent, where the mother's not Jewish or not Jewish, because under the Reform movement's definition, patrilineal descent is enough to declare someone Jewish. So you have these issues that exist, and these people could be. Oh, there was one case of someone. Oh, I know. What was it? Well, there was some famous guy who basically identifies as a Jew, and I know where it comes from. Yeah, Michael Douglas. Michael Douglas. His mother never converted. What's his name? That comedian. Oh, what's his name? He comes across as a Jew. His father's also a comedian.
Mike Myers.
No. His father's also a comedian. Mike Myers actually is more actually.
Martin Short.
No. This guy. His father's also a comedian. His mother was also a comedian, and he's a comedian. Oh, gee whiz. What was
Jerry Stiller.
Jerry Stiller.
The mother's
And
Mira.
Ann Mira was not Jewish. She converted, as I understand it, but I'm not sure about her
but
conversion.
the most famous.
Ben Stiller.
Okay,
is
right.
who you're thinking of.
Right. So the fact is Ben Stiller. Everyone thinks of him as being Jewish, but halakhically he's not.
He's not.
But the most famous example. Who's the most famous example of a person who everyone talks about being Jewish, who clearly halakhically is not Jewish? Come on! The guy who Archie Bunker basically said, why did you turn Jew? Who was that? Sammy Davis Jr. Everyone talks about Jewish. Sammy Davis Jr. was a very devout Reformed Jew. Who's a very, very devout Reformed Jew. He studied, there's pictures of him studying Talmud. He's a very religious Reformed Jew. We don't understand that. We always think religious means Orthodox. They're very religious Reformed Jews. Believers in Reformed Judaism. Like the Reformed rabbi who always says a bracha. So when he sits down to have lobster in the restaurant, he says a bracha first. Because he's a Reformed Jew. And this is his belief. A very religious Reformed Jew. We don't understand those people. I mean, a lot of people don't recognize that there is a religion called Reformed Judaism, and there are people who are very devout Reformed Jews. Sammy Davis Jr. was a very devout Reformed Jew, but he was only converted pursuant to Reformed Judaism. He was not a Jew, halakhically. Here's another example. Okay?
Can
Now-
I bring it forward to Rav Hildesheimer?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the time of Rav Hildesheimer and Rav Frankel?
Yeah.
Was it? Okay. My understanding of today's conservative
Certainly, it's not halachic. It's not it's
deviation,
the,
or what makes it a problem for orthodoxy is the non-belief in Torah Misinai. Is that the case?
who said Zechariah Frankel didn't believe in Torah Misinai?
No, I'm not saying that they did. I want to clarify whether or not they did.
Okay, so the fact is I'm not sure if Zechariah Frankel believed in Torah Misinai.
Okay.
Okay, the fact is if he believed in Torah Misinai, most likely it wasn't the Rambam's understanding of Torah Misinai, which raises issues.
Okay.
Okay, but then you have David Weiss Livni, who basically says, I rely on other Rishonim, even though he doesn't hold the Rambam's definition of Torah Misinai. But you're talking about a very different argument.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with the problem though was not just Torah Misinai. The conservative movement, nowadays most conservative rabbis do not accept Torah Misinai. But the problem is their halachic argument. They are still trying to give, even nowadays they're still trying to give some halachic arguments and so forth, but they're really not technical halachic arguments, right? So the point is because they're halacha is a very technical system, and there's disagreements within the system, and so forth and so forth. The conservative arguments that caused the rift in the beginning were certain arguments which, like for example, one example of what they would do is they would follow a das yachid, a singular position in Rishonim, from anywhere. There's a certain process in halacha which vets which authorities have greater say over the centuries, okay? And usually there's an authority given to the Shulchan Aruch when he sort of says, I'm giving value to this Rishon and that Rishon, and this Rishon he doesn't even mention in the Shulchan Aruch, this position. So there's Yesh Risha Omer and stuff like that, and the Ramah throws it in, and then the Shach throws it in, and so forth. You have a collection of major halachic theories that are sort of found within the corpus of the Shulchan Aruch. I remember once working on an issue in terms of the kahuna and the definition of kahuna and so forth, and trying to be matir a kohen to someone who couldn't marry, and I came across a Tosfos that presented an argument that I thought was totally applicable to this case, and that if I could apply that Tosfos in this halacha as a das yachid, right, I'd have a way to, because b'tzarach gadol you can apply a das yachid and so forth and so forth. I said, okay, so I have a possibility if this person has a voice in the halachic process to even stand as a singular minority opinion that I can rely upon with great need. Okay? Then I saw, as mechaben to it, Rav Moshe has a whole tshuva with the same issue that I was trying to deal with, and he quotes the exact same Tosfos and comes to the exact same conclusion. Then Rav Moshe says, but you can't rely upon it, it doesn't have a standing in halacha. That's it. That was the end of the discussion for me. Rav Moshe basically said that Tosfos does not have the standing to be a halachic voice. Within the conservative movement, that's what they did. What they did is the early conservatives found, they said, we want to create a law like ABC. We're going to find someone in all the literature who will say ABC, and once we got that person, we're going to rely upon it. So, for example, in the brachas in the conservative siddur, okay, we have the bracha shlos ani goy, we have a bracha shlos ani aved, shlos ani isha. We had the bracha in the negative, did not make me a non-Jew. Right? In the conservative, in the conservative they say shasani Yisrael, right? Something like that, right? The fact of the matter is that they found someone somewhere in the history of all the analysis to say this is the bracha we have, and this is the one we're now going to use. Okay, was that really halachic methodology? And that's a problem. So that's an example of early problems with there's other problems also. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's another one which I don't want to get into because it's a little bit more critical, because the person who threw out the article might be people who know the person and has a little bit more, the name is a little bit more known, but the fact of the matter is like the argument anyways, there's other arguments. You look and you really analyze the argument, and you're able to say, you know something? Like, I'm able to be given arguments, and I can look at them and say, who said that? Yeah. Like, someone once tried to do this, and here's an argument, so and this rabbi said it, and I sit there and say, okay, who's the rabbi who said that argument? Turned out to be a conservative rabbi. But, like, one of these halachis rabbis says, thought so. Because there was something subtle in the analysis that I could pick up was not within our Orthodox methodology.
So I have only one final comment, one sentence worth, is that along with what you've been saying, there's been a steady black and whiting of what used to be gray. But it takes knowledge and understanding of what the gray is, of how to interpret, instead of just making a clear black and white.
The fact of the matter is that there is a tremendous fear of expressing the gray. Mm-hmm. Because there's a tremendous fear that if you express the gray, everyone will act as if they're their own posek and make their own decisions. Therefore, what you find in the more right-wing world is that there's a perception that you can't even say there's disagreement, there's an issue, you have to come up black and white, here's the law. And the left-wing world has to respond the same way to feel that they have legitimacy. We're just as adamant as our position. Fact is that there's other aspects in this as well. We haven't even dealt with the issue of change and how can change happen with Orthodoxy and movements of that nature. And the fact is, change happened and so forth. But the truth is that, you know, in terms of the issue is what I think to be a major issue, because we're at the precipice of an issue of a tremendous fragmentation within the Orthodox world, and I think that everything that's happening, it's just we're not learning how to deal with it. Okay, I think I spoke for enough tonight.